It is I, Kenneth, the K-Rock Klein, with our 25th edition of Krocking, Locking and Dropping, the best up-and-coming podcast in the United States and around the world. Come on, people, download this podcast. This is great. This is fantastic. Yes, sirree. I am glad to be back, and folks, I am back from my vacation. I went out of town for about a week or so, and as promised, I am bringing back to you another podcast to, well, sort of recap my vacation, but also kind of talk about some interesting points that have happened over the last couple of weeks or so, or at least this past week for that matter. But I'm really excited to be discussing some few things as well. And right now I'm currently at my parents' place back here, and I'm going to be spending the rest of the weekend there, and then I'm going to go back to Beaumont where we get set for the start of another sports season. Anyways, so we got some things we were going to discuss. I've tried to put this next subject off, but I feel like we need to have some strict rules for what it is when it comes to a dynasty. What counts as a legitimate dynasty? Because I feel like there are a lot more dynasties out there than the ones that people are making it known. It's not just the Warriors, it's not just the Chiefs or the Stros or, or the Patriots and all that. No, there's got to be like more dynasties. Like, I feel like there are a lot more dynasties than most people are giving credit for. So bear with us, folks, as I'm going to give my strict rules on the whole matter. And then I'm going to close out my podcast by talking about a top 5 thing where I'm going to be revealing my top 5 most underrated locations to go visit, like roadside attractions, like it's not just your obvious choices for that matter, but I'm going to be doing all that as we speak. But first, folks, I decided to bring back a couple of pictures. Now, I went out to West Texas, and this is basically a summer thing where, me and my family get together, kind of a family reunion of sorts, and just, get together out there. I hadn't been in the last couple of years, but I figured this was the year I needed to go back because I needed vacation time. And so I was able to go right back, and I'm glad I did because this past year I had some real interesting attractions to went to. So now, interestingly enough, I'm just going to show a couple of quick pictures out here if I can. Unfortunately, if you're listening to the podcast, I apologize, but if you want to see the pictures, you better go subscribe to my YouTube channel at KWCLINE91 so that way you could see these pictures. The first thing that I did was I went with my sister and her boyfriend to Big Bend National Park. And here's a couple of pictures of me. This is me basically overlooking what they call the window of the Big Bend area. You can kind of see the galleyway or the gap between the two rock formations and all that. Yeah, that's me. A little big shirt, extra large shirts. I'm sort of struggling with the whole fashion sense down there between a large and an extra large. I think I'm between those two sizes. I'm trying to work on that, folks. Trying to get back in shape as soon as possible. But that's kind of me. We're overlooking the alleyway. Next picture we were right outside the Santa Elena Canyon, and that is the Rio Grande River. So you keep going down the river, and you will be seeing Mexico on another side for that matter. But I'll blame my sister for this one just because we kind of forgot to bring some water and some sunscreen. I thought, no problem. I could just hike this trail. It's about 1.4 miles. I figured if we can hike it, we'll be all right. But the more I kept hiking it, the more I started to kind of feel the effects. And I felt like I was going to have, give me another 30 or 40 minutes on that hike. I would have had probably a heat stroke or worse. So I didn't travel too far. I want to say I went a mile, but I had to turn back around because, my sister's boyfriend was kind of waiting for me, and we were able to turn right around, and I was able to get some water and some liquids in me at that moment. But big mistake on my part, or our part. Need to bring sunscreen, and we definitely need to bring some water, so I'm very fortunate that I'm okay. Next picture we have is, right behind me is the Rio Grande River, and right behind me is Mexico. Yes. I could have easily swam right across the Grand River and walked right into Mexico, but I don't think that would have been a wise idea. Then we have another picture of me overlooking the mighty Rio Grande. And yes, the Moneyball music that you probably remember. And also more side of Mexico, so very interested in that location, obviously, just seeing Mexico from a different perspective. If you get to Big Bend National Park, you could actually, well, I don't know if they do this anymore, but you can actually cross right into Mexico, as long as you have like a passport or something to that effect. But we didn't go to that area that we could. Next year, I think we're probably going to do that. Then we have Marfa Prada. Now, this is located outside of Marfa, Texas, which is where we saw another historical site. But this Marfa Prada is not a real Prada, though it does kind of look like an actual female person shoe store, for that matter. But this was actually an artist, that created this Marfa Prada. And, it's located on U.S. Route 90 in Jeff Davis County, Texas. So it's close to the town of Valentine, but 26 miles northwest of Marfa, Texas. So it almost feels like, you're driving along and you see some shoes in this spot. Oh, cool. Let's go check it in. But it's really not, for that matter. But it is kind of crazy because, out in West Texas, they have like some small replicas of major storms. In fact, on my way back, I actually got to see a Buc-ee's. There's a Buc-ee's right there, folks. So deal with that. And that was me on my way back to Buc-ee's, for that matter. And so that was a Marfa Prada. Next up, we have a picture, and this is from a night watch goggles. I think that's what they called it. But this is basically where we were at the Marfa lights. Now, you can barely see some of these lights. You're more likely to see it through these goggles and how they flicker about. But also, just where, you might be able to see them during the night sky, for that matter. And, the Marfa lights, no one really knows for sure what they are to this day. Some people say it's UFO-related stuff. Others say it's reflections of the air. Also, maybe reflections of cars driving in the distance, which is kind of hard. No one really has any proof or any idea of what they could possibly be. You can try to fly an airplane at night to get a closer view, but I don't think you're going to find any luck. So it's one of those mysteries that I think will be left unsolved, but I think it also brings the intrigue of all those that come by and visit. Then we have, of course, the McDonald Observatory. I remember I went inside that building one time, but I didn't get a chance to go in because I felt like you needed to take a bus to get up there instead of keeping driving. But driving along the hills and everything, it can really take its toll on you. And so that's the McDonald Observatory. Hopefully next time we get to go back inside. But I do remember going inside that building one time. So that was a real cool thing to experience as well. Now, folks, being out in West Texas, you can have encounters with a lot of things. You can have encounters with lizards. You can have encounters with some, javelinas, or they call them javelinas, but I think they're of a different name. And then, of course, you might have some other animals out there as well. And if you're real fortunate, you might have an encounter with this. Yep, that is an actual juvenile rattlesnake right outside where we were stayed. And I tell you what, folks, I was walking on that trail another 7 or 10 steps, and folks, this podcast doesn't even air. I mean, it would have been really bad, but I'm glad I saw that. And so, yeah, this was actually a juvenile one. It was kind of young, so it didn't have the full effects of what a normal adult rattlesnake was. But, my dad said, hey, as long as their rattlesnake is there to deal with the mice, that's one thing. But we did not want that to happen right there. So we took care of it. We took care of that problem. And as you can see, that is my dad holding the tip end of the snake after cutting off its head. And, so the crazy part about that is that thing was still moving even without its head. Like, I had heard some reports that a snake could still attack you. The head of the snake could still attack you in that particular, even with its head off. So, but the thing was still moving, the coils of that, it was just remarkable. It was so crazy. It was like Rasputin not being able to die even after all the attempts to kill him back in the Russian Revolution days, for that matter. But yeah, so I definitely got to, see that firsthand with some cool experience as well. And then this, of course, is the Rattlesnake tail, the rattle of Rattlesnake. Now, we didn't hear a rattle for that matter, even though afterwards we were able to cut that thing off and we could still hear it rattle. My cousin Mason actually has that with him at the moment, so we're going to give it to him. So he's got something to take back to his parents, and it's going to be crazy. Next up, we have a picture of Coconut Field. That's where the Alpine Cowboys play their games in, Coconut Field. The Alpine Cowboys are like an independent league team. They're not affiliated with anyone in Major League Baseball. But, yeah, I got to go see that. I've been to that field multiple times, not only to see the Cowboys play, but also Sul Ross State University's baseball team plays there. And when I was working at East Texas Baptist, we would drive out to Alpine to play the Lobos, and we got to play on this field. Really cool just to see that field as well. So I was able to kind of sneak into a baseball game for that matter. Folks, that's just the highlights of my trip, and believe it or not, I actually had forgotten about another topic I was going to talk about. I'm going to be talking about a training camp fight that has already taken place, and that involves the Houston Texans. So my thoughts on the whole thing, stay tuned, folks. We're going to be right back to discuss the whole situation with the Texans and that training camp fight that we saw on the internet. So stay tuned. A lot of sports are going on right now. Of course, we're still in the thick of the start of the second half of baseball season. The trade deadline approaching on Tuesday, looking for some big-time moves to be made. Already there's been a trade that has captured my interest. The Seattle Mariners made a trade last night, acquiring Tampa Bay outfielder Randy Arozarena. So the Mariners looking to put themselves in great position to potentially win the AL West, though they're going to have to fight the Astros for that. I think Seattle will still be a very good playoff team, even though Arozarena is batting .211. So trade deadline, of course, is on Tuesday. Hopefully the Astros can be able to get themselves a very strong pitcher, but also maybe a bat or two just to help out in case the lineup is still a little bit unhealthy, even though they've been playing pretty well as of lately to maintain first place in the AL West as of this podcast. So you got baseball still going on. The Olympic Games are just about starting. Opening ceremony is should be happening right now as of this podcast. LeBron James being named the recipient to hold the United States flag for the entire U.S. Olympic team of all athletes. So that's a really big honor for any athlete to be picked by your peers to hold the flag during the opening ceremonies of the Olympic Games. So real honor for LeBron James, and I'm sure one that he'll take with pride, maybe use that in the argument between him and Michael Jordan as well. But we also have football going on, and every team as of now is currently starting their training camp. And folks, when it comes to training camp, you can guarantee that there are a few things that are going to happen. You're going to see a lot of players, sit out of practices and training camp just to rehab. You're going to see some cuts of guys that are going to, trying to make the team, but unfortunately, maybe there's just not enough room for them, or maybe they aren't a good fit for that team. And you're going to see some skirmishes. And unfortunately, at least from my end, but we had a skirmish that happened a couple of days ago, and the Houston Texans find themselves in the skirmish, starting off the skirmishes for the NFL. And this was kind of a shocking one. Now, let me say this. Skirmishes and fights, they happen all the time in every training camp. The Kansas City Chiefs had one last year, and they ended up winning the Super Bowl. Now, I'm not saying if you get into a skirmish, you're going to win the Super Bowl. That's not what I'm saying, obviously. I mean, every team goes through that. It's just that there's one winner. But, fights and skirmishes, they're going to happen, and I think we have to accept that reality. But yesterday, or a few days ago, the Texans actually got themselves in a skirmish. And kind of really what upset me a lot is the fact that this whole thing was kind of overblown, because most people believe that it was Stephon Diggs who started it. Now, we know that Stephon Diggs has a reputation for possibly being a diva, a guy that was wanting for more touches and everything. And the reason why he was kind of complaining is because, when he played last year for the Bills, they got off to a bit of a slow start, even though he was putting up a lot of yards. But then somewhere middle of the season, they changed the offense. They were able to go towards a little bit more of a running game. And that really turned the tides for Buffalo. Unfortunately, it meant that Stephon Diggs was not going to get a lot of touches. And I think that's kind of where his frustration boiled over. And he finally said, after all these few years, because he went to Buffalo to take that Buffalo team into a Super Bowl contender. And they were. They just weren't able to get to the Super Bowl. They got to the AFC Championship game, but they have not been able to break through. And since then, they have not even gotten back to the AFC Championship game. So a lot of things have not gone well for Diggs and the Bills. So Diggs ends up getting traded to the Texans. And a lot of people have been concerned, wondering, how's this going to affect C.J. Stroud? How's that going to affect the offense? Well, to this point, the reviews for Diggs have been really positive. He's been a role model. He's been a mentor. He's been a leader. So far, very positive reviews. But there's still some people that are questioning whether or not, it's going to hold up during the regular season and whether or not this is going to be a distraction for the team, especially a team that's expected to take that next leap into AFC Championship contention, let alone Super Bowl contention for that matter. And he's only signed with the Texans for 1 year, so there's definitely going to be a lot of attention on him. And yet, a few days ago, he wasn't necessarily the one that started this whole thing, but, well, you can argue that he might have set it off, but it wasn't like he got in that skirmish. So what happened was the Texans were, having a scrimmage. They were driving. C.J. Stroud hit Stephon Diggs open for the middle inside the red zone, and as Diggs was going down, it looked like Jimmy Ward was, trying to make the tackle. He kind of slid right in and sort of hit him as Diggs was going down, which, it's one of those unfortunate things that happens. Like if you're a defensive back, you can't really stop or contain momentum as you're trying to get him down, but you don't, it's hard to really stop, especially when you see a receiver go down. But it's just one of those unfortunate things. So he kind of hit him in a bad spot, and Diggs got up, took it a little personally. And, he said, hey, I didn't appreciate that. And, Diggs and Ward were kind of jawing back and forth with each other. And, it's just a competition and everything. And so Stephon Diggs and Ward were getting into each other. And then you had the entire offensive players and defensive players trying to separate the two just to make sure nothing exploded and all that. And Dalton Schultz, the tight end for the Texans, had some things to say for Jimmy Ward. Because I think there was a situation last year where Ward hit him down low, or hit him during practice, and he didn't like that very much. So he was trying to defend. Schultz was trying to defend Diggs, and Ward, wasn't happy with that as well. And Dalton Schultz, gets into it. There's just more words going off. Everything seems to be calming down. Players are separating themselves, and out of nowhere, Derek Stingley Jr., the cornerback for the Texans, just runs up to Schultz. And he pulls him down, like, for no apparent reason. And that's when all hell broke loose. A melee happens, and their players are trying to separate them. And so, yeah, it's a bit of a very interesting situation that has happened. But it just sometimes makes you wonder, like, what in the world was Derek Stingley thinking? Because it seemed very out of character for him to do this, like to, respond and take down, Dalton Schultz in that matter. I mean, what happened for that matter? You had to think that something had happened during practice that sort of set off Stingley Jr. to respond to that. And then, of course, you find out later that Dalton Schultz had actually hit him during practice. Like, I guess while he was trying to block him, he kind of pushed him down on the field, and Stingley didn't like that, and I guess there was an open opportunity for that. And, that's what led to all melee. So, apparently the Texans got into a fight, and the social media reactions, they sort of were overblowing Stephon Diggs' role in that skirmish. I mean, look, Stephon Diggs, he might have unintentionally started it, but it wasn't like he was going there to fight. He was just trying to talk to Jimmy Ward and say, hey, look, I did not appreciate you doing that. And they were just kind of going back and forth, just a competition. And for whatever reason, Stingley takes his frustration out on Dalton Schultz, and that's when everything just went wrong. So, but yeah, I think a lot of people were trying to overblow Stephon Diggs' role in that, and I think it's absolutely ridiculous. Diggs has been nothing but, to this point, a model teammate. Now, whether that changes or not will remain to be seen as the season gets underway. But, he wasn't involved in that fight. It was Schultz and Stingley, and then you have players trying to break those two up. You watched a video clip of that fight. Diggs wasn't even in the pile. He was just trying to, getting away from that. He wasn't involved. Now, whether he should have helped out to break it up, that's a whole different matter, but it just is unfortunate that this had actually happened in the skirmishes. And so I think, from my perspective, I think having a skirmish, as long as it's a fair one and not unexpectedly, is understandable. Because I think it's a way for teams to, kind of resolve their issues right then and there on the field. Because look, if this was a training camp situation, and if this had happened during a game, guess what? Everybody, those two guys are going to get ejected. Like, it would be very costly if this had happened during a football game, for that matter. And it could have come back to bite the Texans if they were to lose those guys because of the ejections. So, D'Amico Ryans, the team's head coach, will be, was interviewed or had his press conference today. And he had this to, first off, let's see what he said, what he was asked about the big fight, for that matter.
Since the spirits were picked up a little bit last practice with the, what do you mean?
Okay, so he was asked initially about the fight, like how the spirits had been picked up from, that fight that happened yesterday. And he's like, well, what do you mean? And all that. And I'm sure he knows about it. But anyway, he was asked to respond, or he gave his thoughts on whole skirmishes and whether or not they were a part of it. So this is what he had to say.
Yeah, go ahead and do what you need to.
Well, when it comes to the skirmishes in practice, I don't want it. Right? I don't want it. I also understand it. Myself as a player, I was involved in some, so I'm not going to act like it doesn't happen, right? And the tempers get raised, guys. It's camp. It always happens in camp. You have skirmishes and fights, but what I tell guys is what can we learn from it? For me, if we're in a game, like, are you throwing hands in the game? If you do, then you're thrown out of the game. So for me, it's just learning a lesson, man. You throw punches, whatever you do, are you really protecting the team? Because now you're kicked out of the game. So I don't want it. I don't like it. It's sloppy. I think it's not representative of who we are, as a team, as an organization. It's not what we're about. We're not encouraging that, but it does happen in camp. Just want guys to move forward from it. Nobody's holding any grudges. We're still teammates. We're still brothers, right? Skirmishes happen in our families all the time. We get upset, but at the end of the day, we're still family. It's still all love.
But you can see how that.
Yeah, so basically, the whole thing, the skirmishes, they're going to happen no matter how you look at it. I mean, every team at some point is going to have a skirmish. So ideally, I don't like it personally. I would hate it, especially if it happened during a game. But I feel like now would be the good time to maybe get out your frustrations over that. So that way you can understand, like, you get your frustrations out, let them know, hey, I didn't like that, and we're going to go fight right now. But then afterwards, once you calm down, that's when you can talk about it and say, okay, this is why I didn't like it. I need you to understand my side. And then maybe the player says, well, I apologize for that. I wasn't trying to do that, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do. Like, you have to have some kind of communication forming between all parties involved in that situation. Now, I don't like it if a fight happens and there's an injury. That's another thing. Because, Dalton Schultz, like, Stingley just jumped right on him, and he could have taken out his shoulder for that matter. And fortunately, it doesn't seem like there's been a negative vibe for that matter. And it just, it's one of those things, like, I really hate fights in particular. Like, I don't like it when players from teams fight because there's obviously going to be some major consequences, especially if it happens during a game. I want to say I've seen a couple of fights, whether I was broadcasting or whether I was actually involved or at a game or professional sports game. I've seen a fight here or there. I really don't like it, but training camp and practice, okay. But don't overdo it with that. You don't want to have a 1993 Houston Oilers situation where, the Oilers had brought in Buddy Ryan to be the defensive coordinator after his stint with the Bears and then as head coach of the Eagles, and caused some disruption, which led to the offensive coordinator Kevin Gilbride and him kind of swinging at each other during a nationally televised game. That was one of the most dysfunctional seasons. That's another podcast unto itself. But you don't want to have that happen at that particular moment. And now, as far as what I would do if I were in D'Amico Ryan's shoes, and of course I'm not D'Amico Ryan's, but if I were in his shoes and I were the head coach, I would have both Dalton Schultz and Derek Stingley come to the office and say, okay, what happened? Let's talk about it. And then just let Schultz know, look, you got to be aware it's a competition, but Stingley, I know you're a very good player, and if you weren't a good player, I would cut you in a heartbeat. But since you are a good player, I'm going to warn you, you need to cut it, be careful, because that could easily change people's perception about you. Now, I've already seen tweets, and I've already seen people on social media say, oh, Stingley's like a thug, he needs to be cut, this and that, I don't want him on my team. Well, that's a one-time thing. Like, who are you to judge a person based on one time? I don't think that's right. Like, if this were to happen again, then we might have an issue. But this is a one-time thing. I would just let the whole thing slide, and let's just see what happens on the field, because we know Stingley, he doesn't appear to be that type of player. He might not have liked what happened between him and Schultz, and he took it out on him. But I don't think that's going to really define him as a person or as a player. We got to be very careful with how we judge people based on one incident, for that matter. And I think it's wrong. One slip up, you got to have a pass. But if it happens again, then we can talk about it. But I think they got to be very careful. They got to be very smart out there. And I think this team is going to be holding each other accountable. And I think that's what's going to happen. Coach Ryans will figure out a way to keep these guys accountable, for that matter. So, but look, training camp fights, they're going to happen. There's going to be a lot of them. I've seen other teams get into fights. So just because it's the Texans, because they're expecting to have a really good season, they're playing a first-place schedule, they're expected to be one of the teams to contend for the AFC, having to get past the likes of the Chiefs, the Ravens, the Bengals, and the Bills, for that matter. It's going to be a big season for them. And I think their franchise is wanting desperately, to make that next step, but all eyes are on it because of what they did in the offseason, acquiring the big-name talent players that they added to that roster to make them a legitimate Super Bowl contender. But also in the AFC South, because, again, I think the AFC South is definitely going to be one of the toughest divisions. The Colts are still a threat. The Jaguars are still a threat. Tennessee, they're a sleeper team, I might say that. So, therefore, that's going to be a really tough division to keep an eye on. But I think the Texans, get it out now. Get your frustrations out with that. But let's move forward. Let's get together and work on it. Because trust me, folks, we got a preseason game next week in Canton, Ohio. We're honoring Andre Johnson, who's getting inducted. And we're going to be playing against a Bears team that we're going to be playing later in the season with Caleb Williams, the number 1 draft pick. So we got to start focusing on that as far as, from a fan's perspective. For that team. So just my thoughts on the whole thing. I think it was overblown. Some things are overblown, but these fights happen. They're going to happen, and you're just going to have to live with that and deal with them. So that's the way I look at it. And now, when we come back, folks, I may be getting onto a bit of a rant here with my next segment, but I think I need to get my thoughts on this matter across. So stay tuned, folks. We're going to be talking about my rules for how a dynasty should be in sports. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. I have been avoiding this subject for quite some time, and the reason why I've avoided it is simply because when I think about this particular word, it kind of makes me cringe because there have been a lot of great teams in history. There have been some teams that have been so dominant and so good that we kind of refer to them as a D word. I'm talking about the Patriots, I'm talking about the Chiefs, I'm talking about the Warriors, the Bulls, the Celtics, the Cowboys, the 49ers, the Steelers, the Yankees, the Giants, and I cringe every time I think about this because in my opinion it should be the case for the Astros, but some people might not look at it that way, and understandably so, but I still feel that it should be that way, and I think a lot of people might see it as time goes on. But there's one D word that really bothers me, and that is dynasty. Now, we all know that there have been a lot of great teams and a lot of dynasties over the years. But I think the biggest problem is we have held the dynasty term to such an extent that it almost feels like an exclusive gentleman's club. Well, let me put it this way. It's more like a special fraternity, an aristocratic kind of club, like it's only for the rich of the rich, the elite of the elite, and I don't think that's always been the case because, I think back to the Stros run, the championship runs, the fact that they've been to 7 straight ALCSs, they've appeared in 4 World Series and won 2 championships. That should qualify as a dynasty considering that it's a baseball, which is a little bit different. But then you have all those that say, well, if you want to be a dynasty, you have to win 3. But then again, there was that whole situation in 17 that happened. And look, I don't care, okay? I don't think it would have made a difference either way. It still is a championship regardless, because at the end of the day, if I were the opposing team, I would have been upset that I lost 2 games that could have determined the outcome of the World Series, but I didn't. That's that. Yes, I still think the Stros have another championship in them. If not this year, then hopefully within the next near future. So that way they can continue to add to what has already been a golden era and potentially among the best dynasties in sports. But that being said, I feel like if there's one thing that really bothers me and makes me upset, it's the fact that when it comes to sports topics, there is no set standard for how teams should be able to, like how things should be run. There's no set standard for who should win the MVP. There's no set standard for, who wins awards or who gets in the Hall of Fame, or better yet, well, there is a set standard for Hall of Fame, but what about who's a dynasty, who's an all-time great in everything? Like there's no set standards because I feel like it opens the door for a lot of these debates and a lot of these conversations that some people will see great players as Hall of Fame worthy, whereas others don't. Some people see guys as MVP worthy, whereas others don't. Like, I think back to James Harden. James Harden, in my opinion, should have won 2 MVP awards. He should have he didn't win in 2015, even though he was individually the best player, but Steph Curry led the Warriors to a great record in that season, and he ultimately would have won that award. So I don't blame the MVP for going to Steph Curry. In 2017, Harden led the Rockets to a better record, but Russell Westbrook got the award because of all the triple doubles. And you take Russell Westbrook away, the Thunder don't make the playoffs. I mean, I could definitely understand it, but that's where it kind of cringes with me. There's no set standards. And just like the case where there is no set standard for how a dynasty should be. And I sit back and I'm thinking to myself, there has got to be a way to determine, a proper way, because I can promise you this, there are more great teams out there. Some of these teams, not every dynasty is created equal, okay? Some of these teams may not have won 3 championships in a short span like the Kansas City Chiefs. Some teams might have been to multiple championships and only won half of them. And that's they continue to be that way. Then you have some teams that might have made it to 4 straight Super Bowls but lost every single time, or you win 14 division titles, appear in 5 World Series, but come up with 1 championship. I mean, does that make them a great dynasty? You know, I think to a certain extent we have lost track of what a dynasty is. Because I know that I'm going to give a special shout out to Houston Stress-Ins, because he had posted a graphic about how over the last 7 years, every single, the last 4 teams in Major League Baseball have always involved the Astros, because they've always been in the ALCS going back to 2017. And it's kind of become a recurrent holiday. Now, I don't know if that's going to happen this year. It may happen where they might make it to 8 in a row, but it may not. Or it may be a one-off thing, and maybe next year they'll get back, but who knows. But, you know, I made a comment. I said Dynasty, and I had a lot of people that liked it. But then, of course, I had a lot of people, a lot of haters, a lot of casual fans that said, no, that's not how it works. And I'm like, okay, well, what's your definition? Where does it say in the rule book that this is the rules for a dynasty? Because I promise you, there are more dynasties. In fact, if the rule is you have to win 3 championships in a short span, why did the NFL Network decide to come up with a top 10 list for greatest dynasties of all time? And they included the Buffalo Bills, who went to 4 straight Super Bowls and lost every single one. Or they included the 1970s Miami Dolphins, who made it to 3 straight Super Bowls and lost the first one but won the next 2. Why did they include all those teams when it didn't meet the requirements? Because I think the problem is there are a lot more dynasties, yet people seem to use that in terms of an aristocratic kind of feeling. You know what I mean? Like, it's really a special club. It's like you're being invited to the royal wedding, and there's only like 500 invitations, and yet there are thousands and millions of people that want to be invited, but only 500 or so people can go. Or better yet, let's say you get invited to the president of the United States cabinet. Now, I don't know who's going to win the election, if it's Trump or if it's Kamala Harris or if it's somebody else. I don't know. I'm not really interested in that. But you get invited to the cabinet meeting, and that's a very prestigious honor, even though there are a lot of people that would like to be part of this cabinet thing. But going back to my point, my problem with this is there is no set standard. There are no rules, like no legitimate rule books for dynasties, because everybody has a different rule for how a dynasty should be. So I'm sitting there and I'm thinking about a way that we got to get this dynasty thing figured out. And I think I have the perfect solution. Now, some of y'all may not agree with me, and that's totally fine, but here's my opinion. This is the way I look at it. It's maybe a little complicated to some people, and I'll try to explain it to you, but I think you definitely should hear what I have to say. So, basically, you know, a short way to get into a dynasty is, okay, you win back-to-back, you win 2 and 3. You know, if you win 2 and 3 or win back-to-back, guess what? You're already a mini dynasty. But here's the catch. When you win your first championship, that opens the door for a 10-year window. You have 10 years to try to elevate yourself into more of a dynasty. You're not a dynasty yet, but you create a door opening to become one. And if you then win a second championship, congratulations, you are officially in the Dynasty Club. However, you are not the elite of the elite. You are not part of the first class of a ship. But the more championships you win within that stretch, the higher you rank your dynasty status within those 10 years. Unless you decide you can't pay the fare anymore, you have to start all over, and you get off even before you get a chance to, you know, conclude your 10-year window. So let me use an example. Let me pick a random sports team. I'm picking the Indiana Pacers. Let's just pick them, for example. So let's say next year, the Indiana Pacers win a championship. It would be their first championship, not only in franchise history, but in this era. The Indiana Pacers win a championship. Now that opens the door for a 10-year window. And let's say that Indiana continues. Like next year, the Indiana Pacers make the playoffs, and they don't get back to the finals. Does that mean they're a bad team? Does that mean they're out? No. It just means you have about 9 more years to try to elevate your dynasty status. You're not at the dynasty level yet, but you have a chance to elevate yourself. So then the following year, Indiana wins the championship. Now, that's 2 in 3 years. And that means Indiana is a mini dynasty. I'm not saying they're a strong dynasty. So basically, by winning a second championship, you're in the door to the club. You're just not going to be among the center of attention or among the most famous of people. You could still be there. You could still engage with conversations with other teams that are in your club, but you're not in that first class kind of realm. But if you win more over the next few years and maybe make it to another finals, and if you lose, then so what? So be it. But you have at least 8 or 7 more years to elevate yourself as a dynasty. And you know what? You have that opportunity to do just that. So I feel like every team that wins their first championship should start a 10-year window. And within that 10-year stretch, you have to be one of the most consistent teams out there. You have to be one of the best. You have to make it to another championship. You have to at least get to the Western Conference or Eastern Conference Finals or LCS, AFC, NFC Championship game, or maybe the final round before the Stanley Cup Finals if you're a hockey believer. I think if you have to be among those, you have to keep making appearances, and you have to win another championship in that stretch. Because let's be real, it's all about trying to be consistent, be dominant, and that's hard to do because all these other teams are wanting the same thing that you are, and if they don't get it this year, then they're going to get another chance next year. Because now you're the target if you win. But let's think about it this way. You're consistently among the top teams. But if you are stuck with one championship and not another trip to the finals, the chances of you elevating yourself to greater status is getting slimmer and slimmer. Because if you win your first year and you're on the outskirts, but you don't win another championship until your 8th year in this window. And that just means the chances of you getting to a center stage to being among the greats is not likely. It sucks, but you're still a dynasty. You're just not remembered as such. So, are you guys following me here? I mean, I know this sounds kind of crazy when you really think about it because there's always going to be those casuals that are going to say 3 in a short span or this and that, yada, yada, yada. Listen. The Kansas City Chiefs did not need to beat the San Francisco 49ers this past season to win a Super Bowl to be a dynasty because they already were a dynasty after they beat the Philadelphia Eagles. No matter what people may say about the whole Astro situation in 17, it doesn't matter. They're a dynasty. 8 straight LCSs, 7 straight LCSs, hopefully 8. 7 straight LCSs, 4 World Series appearances, 2 titles. Guess what? There were 2 teams in baseball dynasties that went through that same round. The 1966 through 1971 Baltimore Orioles with guys like Frank Robinson, Jim Palmer, Brooks Robinson, Hall of Fame players. That was a great team. They made 4 World Series in a 7-year stretch, and they only won 2. Could they have won a third? Absolutely, but they didn't. Then you had the Big Red Machine. They made it in a 7-year stretch. They were in the NLCS every single year from 1970 to 1976. They made it to 4 World Series, and they won 2. Now, they won back-to-back in 75 and 76 after losing their first 2 appearances. But they were still a strong team. That's one of the most historic teams of all time, the Big Red Machine. Johnny Bench, Pete Rose, Joe Morgan, Cesar Geronimo, Ken Griffey Sr., Tony Perez, I can go think about the list that goes on and on with those great players. And Sparky Anderson, the great manager. But they were a dynasty, even if they only won their 2 championships late. Same thing applies to the Stros. And look, there's still a chance that they can win another championship, and I have confidence that they will. And hopefully, in my time, I see them win a 3rd or maybe a 4th championship. But I think we have kind of over-evaluated what a dynasty is. We don't have set standards. So once again, here's my rule. You win your first championship in an era. You open a 10-year window. You're not in the dynasty talk yet, But if you win your second championship in those 10 years, you are in the dynasty conversation. It's just that if you wait until much later in that window, chances of you being among the greatest are not going to help. But it does also help your case if you are consistently in the top, like the final four, among the strongest teams. It does help if you're consistently in that regard. You know? I mean, this is one of those biggest things that kind of I have a huge gripe about. Maybe it's because the only, like, we've seen some dynasties in Houston, they just don't get mentioned as much. Maybe the only real legitimate dynasty that Houston has had were the Comets back from 1997 to 2000. Cheryl Swoops, Cynthia Cooper, Tina Thompson, 4 straight WNBA titles, a feat that has never been topped in that whole WNBA. Maybe, I mean, you could say the Rockets in the mid-90s were somewhat of a dynasty for going back-to-back, even though it's hard to really look at them as a strong dynasty considering that they were in the middle of the Bulls runs, although I still think they would have beaten the Bulls. And then, of course, the whole Astros thing, with there's still a chance that they can elevate themselves. My brother thinks that they're a dynasty. We have people in Houston that think they're a dynasty. I certainly think they're a dynasty. I know that there is a lot of people that are going to refute this, but you know what? You can play the losing game all you want, but that's the reality. They have been one of the strongest, most consistent, dangerous teams, and they're still a threat to win, even with all that they've had to endure. They may not be the strongest team in their franchise history at this point, but they're still dangerous. You have to play close to perfect to knock them out, to beat them. That's what the Red Sox did in 2018, Nationals in 2019, Tampa in 20, the Braves in 21, and the Rangers last year. All those teams had to face a really strong, tough Astros team that could have easily won another 2 or 3 championships in that stretch. And I still think that there's another one coming for the city of Houston. Just as much as I think there may be another dynasty in Houston, the Texans. Now, it's a little early to say because, again, you got to get to the AFC Championship and the Super Bowl. But I truly believe that there is a dynasty. There have been a dynasty in Houston, and there will be a dynasty in Houston. But I also think for all these other teams that are struggling, like, to have an argument, like the Detroit Bad Boy Pistons of Isaiah Thomas and Joe Dumars, Bill Laimbeer, that's a dynasty. They made 3 straight trips to the NBA Finals in the late 80s. They only won back-to-back championships, but I still think they're a dynasty, even if people don't like it. I think the Philadelphia Flyers in the mid-'70s are somewhat of a dynasty. They won back-to-back championships, made a 3rd straight. I mean, the Broad Street Bullies, that's a dynasty. Not quite on level with the Montreal Canadiens or the New York Islanders or the Edmonton Oilers, but hey, they're a dynasty. Pittsburgh Penguins, back-to-back titles, yeah, they're a mini dynasty. They just weren't able to elevate themselves to a greater dynasty status. There are more dynasties out there, just like there are more Pokemon out there. We just have yet to experience it. And I hope that eventually we come to a rule book where we give credit to every single one of those teams that fit the qualifications from my qualifications of a dynasty. Now, you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute. Isn't that equivalent to giving everyone a participation trophy and everything? The New Orleans Saints don't count as a dynasty because they haven't been able to elevate themselves to an NFC Championship game, let alone the Super Bowl, in a 10-year stretch after they won their first one. So you have to think that the dynasty talk needs to be reevaluated. And I hope as time goes on and wounds heal that maybe we need to start reestablishing what should count as a dynasty. If the Denver Nuggets win their championship this year, or the Boston Celtics win the championship this year, they're in a dynasty conversation. They just have to have an opportunity to elevate themselves even more to be among the greats. The San Antonio Spurs, they never won back-to-back championships, but they proved that they were a dynasty by winning 4 titles in an 8-year stretch, even if it wasn't back-to-back. So that's the way I look at it. I'm trying not to be a little biased here, but I really feel like we need to change the way we look at how dynasties are, because it's not just about the championships. It's about how dominant you were in that era. And all those teams that I mentioned, they were dominant in their era. So that's what I hope for. But that's just my opinion on that whole matter. And folks, stay tuned. When we come back, I got a little special treat for y'all. I'm going to be talking about the top 5 most underrated roadside attractions that you guys should probably see down when you get a chance for an opportunity. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be right back. That y'all need to know about me, it's that I like to explore. Now, I like to travel sometimes when the opportunity presents itself. Obviously, I just came back from vacation, and sometimes I travel with my sports teams at Lamar to their away games, and typically get to spend the night at hotels and everything, and then go on the road trip, and then just come back, whether it's by bus or by plane. And but usually what I like to do sometimes is I like to go out to places that are very, I don't want to say unknown, but so underrated because there's a curiosity about them. Like, look, I went to the Alamo. I went to the San Jacinto Monument. I went to Washington, D.C. I mean, I got to do all these cool things. I went to London. I saw Big Ben, and I saw Buckingham Palace. This was about a few years before the Queen unfortunately passed away. I mean, I've been pretty much to every big place. Well, not all big places. I mean, I would like to go to Australia a chance if I could. But I've been to Paris. I'd seen the Eiffel Tower. I was actually on top of the Eiffel Tower, I think. I could be wrong. Been to New York. I went up the Empire State Building, went up the Statue of Liberty, and yes. So, I mean, almost any big place that I can think of off the top of my head, I've been there or I haven't been there. But what I'm saying is, I'm thinking more about along the terms of just going to places that are very underrated. These places don't have that same prestige as maybe like the ones that you would probably be accustomed to. But they are like great roadside attractions. Just something about them that makes you stop in your car, get out, look at it, and have a full appreciation for what it is that they were. So considering that this past road trip, I drove through McDonald Observatory. I went to Big Ben, and also I didn't mention this at the top of the podcast, but on my way back, I did drive through Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, the site of that mass shooting, and I didn't want to, post any pictures or bring it up just because I wanted to be very respectful for the families and the victims. And I know there's a lot of craziness that's still going on down there in terms of how the reaction for that particular day, and I had a lot of questions about that. I'm not going to get too involved or talking about it as much, but I do want to again extend my condolences to all the families that lost a loved one on that day. But I did drive through Uvalde just to see the school and everything. But I usually go to these places just as a curiosity thing, locations that I don't think anybody would be ideal to see. Maybe for me, it may be the only time I might be able to see it. So I just figured, let's just go to these places and just, get a good look at it. And I have come up with a top 5 list of the most underrated places that I think people should go see and in their time. So most of this stuff is like around Texas and Louisiana or in Oklahoma, but there isn't one that actually is outside of those states. So bear with me on that one. But anyways, here are my top 5 places to visit. Well, actually, before I do that, I do want to give an honorable mention. Alamo Village. Now, if you've seen the John Wayne movie, The Alamo, you know that the Alamo was built on the set out in Brackettville, Texas, where John Wayne had built the replica of the Alamo. And for many years afterwards, the set had still there. It was used for other great movies like Lonesome Dove and, another Alamo movie that was filmed there, and just other Western kind of, movies. And so I went to the Alamo Village with my family back in 2003. We got to see the sights, We had a good meal over there. We even got to enjoy the country music people playing country songs, most notably Mamas, don't let your babies grow up to be cowboys and all that, But it's really sad. A few years ago, they actually shut down that location, and I'm a little disappointed by it because I really feel like it should still be there. I actually drove right up to the gates. I couldn't get in, obviously, because it was closed, but it was really sad not being able to, think of the Alamo Village as it was anymore. So disappointed by that. That's the reason why it's an honorable mention, is because it's no longer there, but it was a really cool place to see. Now, here is my top 5 locations, places to go. Number 5, the Texas Pythian Home, I think is what they call it, in Weatherford, Texas. Now, the Texas Pythian Home for children is called the Castle on a Hill. It was built with an architecture style of a castle due to the sponsorship of the Knights of the Pythias, a fraternal order established during the Civil War. The Pythians put their motto of friendship, charity, and benevolence into practice and established a Pythian home in 1909. That's according to the website. But the reason why I went there is because I actually saw a movie called 12 Mighty Orphans, and I actually read the book about it. It's based on a true story of a group of orphans who, during the Great Depression, who formed this Texas high school football team, and they were one of the most dominant high school teams in that era, so much so that, the people tend to forget that they were orphans. And they had some great runs all the way to appearances in the state championship. And I'm not going to spoil the movie for all the people there. You'll have to go see it for yourself. But Luke Wilson was in that movie. Martin Sheen and Robert Duvall was also in this movie. Some great movies. Great movie it was, in my opinion. But basically, it was a real interesting thing, to see that building, because it almost kind of has it looks as if it's like a mystique, almost like something you would see like a castle or so. That's why they call it a castle on a hill. But, you see that, and you kind of imagine all the kids that were living in that environment due to the Great Depression, whether their parents were struggling to get some jobs or they couldn't, afford the finances to keep them around. And it's a real touching story. I actually saw that movie, and then on my way back from where I was a couple years back, I got an opportunity to drive through Weatherford, Texas, and see that. And it's really intriguing, the building, and, it was just unbelievable. And, there was a dormitory, there was an office, a mess hall, and a shared apartment, and even a printing press, which is kind of unique. So I thought it was really cool to go see that movie, and also to see that building. So it's the Texas Pythian Home. I think that's how you pronounce it. I could be wrong. It's in Weatherford, Texas, in Parker County, which is just outside of like Fort Worth and everything. So definitely a good location for you to go see. And also to see the movie 12 Mighty Orphans. That's a good movie I would recommend. Number 4, Mount Olivet Cemetery in Hugo, Oklahoma. Now, this cemetery is very unique because a lot of people, you go to the cemetery and you'll be seeing like pictures of circus performers. These are lion tamers, elephant trainers, acrobats, clowns, everything. They call it the Clown Cemetery just because of all the people that, I guess were, had performed in the circus during the heydays. And, I'm looking at this one right now. One cemetery that tombstone, headstone, says, "Watch the Snake Popcorn," who was born in 1940 and passed away in 2012. So that was really interesting. The picture on his headstone is that of a derby hat with a cane and also clown shoes. So, if you go there, you might be intrigued to know that this was a circus cemetery. But I wouldn't have gone to this circus cemetery if not for the fact that there were 2 cemeteries of people that weren't circus performers, but were actually rodeo stars. One, of course, was the legendary Freckles Brown, who was best known for conquering the unrideable bull at the time, Tornado. Kind of ironic since Oklahoma has a lot of those every single year. But Freckles Brown did the unthinkable. He rode the unrideable bull tornado for 8 seconds, and he became a legend out of that. He was truly one of the greatest riders of all time in the world. And then the other one, the one that's actually right next to Freckles Brown, is Lane Frost. Now, if you had seen the movie 8 Seconds starring Luke Perry, who I'm sure is already having conversations with, Lane Frost, the real Lane Frost and Luke Perry up above, talking about just the great honor and the opportunity to portray such a respected rider. But Lane Frost was a young bull rider who was one of the best bull riders out there. He was a champion. He unfortunately died in a tragic accident when the bull that he was riding kind of pierced him in the heart area, and unfortunately he passed away. But it was so interesting to know that you had these two guys, Lane Frost and Freckles Brown, with their cemeteries literally like next to each other. And in Hugo, Oklahoma, which is like the first town in South Oklahoma once you cross the border from Texas to Oklahoma. So I thought it was really, really cool. Paid my respects to two of the greatest bull riders out there in the world. And it's kind of weird how they have it in Circus Town, USA, with all these other ones. But usually, if you like the circus, that's a place for you to go. But if you really want to be respectful and you want to go see these two guys, go to Mount Olivet Cemetery. It'll let you open in and just, be very respectful and be, remember the two bull riders that were there. And also watch the movie 8 Seconds. That's a really good movie. Probably the best rodeo movie out there. Maybe it's the only rodeo movie out there, but who knows? Number 3, the former Nickelodeon Studios. Yes, so 2017, I went down to Orlando. Second time I went there. Went to Universal Studios. Didn't really get to ride any of the rides because it was really there for a business trip. And actually got to tour around Universal Studios. It was a nighttime occasion. And for some reason, I actually saw the former Nickelodeon Studios site. And this was a production studio, and theme park around Universal Studios Florida. This is where they had all the shows. I'm thinking about Carissa Explains It All. I'm thinking of game shows like Super Sloppy Double Dare, Nickelodeon Guts. It was really crazy how, this used to be the site for all these kids shows that I grew up watching. Even though I was born in the 1990s, I did see them in the late 90s, and it was so amazing just to see that. And I definitely was really impressed, that nowadays it used to be the Nickelodeon Studios, but now it was like the former home of the Blue Man Group, or now was the current home of the Blue Man Group Performance. It's nowhere near the Nickelodeon Studios that you used to go to, like you used to watch. And it's just so sad how, like, Nickelodeon, I know it's gotten a lot of flack lately because of a recent documentary that came out and all that. And I apologize for all the actors or all the people that worked there that went through that. I definitely do apologize and feel bad for them. But it was really a generational thing that I grew up watching all the shows on Nickelodeon. And yeah, I really wanted to go there as a kid. And unfortunately, I waited until after all the evidence of Nickelodeon was gone when I went down there. But it was really nice, a special tribute I paid towards that building. And yeah, it was, it's really sad that it's kind of closed at this point. And it's only remembered for, now I think it was still occupied by the Blue Man Group, but it used to be really cool. I really wanted to be an actor on a Nickelodeon TV show. In fact, I still kind of feel that way. Obviously, with better writers, better people in there to run the Nickelodeon studios and everything, not the ones that caused all the controversy, of course. So I wouldn't want to go that far. So Nickelodeon Studios, the former Nickelodeon Studios, is number 3. Now, number 2 is Gibson, Louisiana, the highway of Gibson, Louisiana. Now, during the Great Depression, there was a number of gangsters, criminals that were making on the run, and perhaps none of them were more infamous than Bonnie and Clyde. And Bonnie and Clyde were a Texas couple that went on a run, robbing banks left and right, and they drove they were driving down, I guess, to meet up with someone when they were ambushed and shot and killed in Gippsland, Louisiana, in just outside of that small town. Now, I went down there. I stopped. I drove past the museum. I didn't go inside, but I drove past the museum, and then I went through Highway 154. I actually drove 2.5 miles south on Highway 154, and then, of course, I drove another 5.5 down that same route, and there is a monument on the side of the road. There's a monument, and there's also another marker. And as it turns out, that monument actually is this site of where Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down. There was a monument that talked about it, and they also actually show bullet holes on this monument to make it seem like there was an ambush in that area. So seeing a location where Bonnie and Clyde, the infamous gangsters, were taken out after their run from the law. I mean, my goodness gracious. Can you imagine living in that time and hearing all these stories of Bonnie and Clyde, and you were just cheering for them to, keep going, keep breaking banks, robbing banks, and then just running from the law, especially in a time where not many people were gaining anything financially due to the stock market crash from 1929. Can you imagine being at that point? But yeah, I mean, it was really interesting to see the location there. And just kind of thinking back on it, I mean, you obviously you can understand where they were coming from. They wanted to make something out of themselves, but that of course meant robbing the banks and robbing from the law, which is wrong. But I think at that point, anyone would have done anything to get some money. Of course, as long as they used it properly. But it was really cool to see, Bonnie and Clyde's last spots on this earth before they were gunned down, and kind of eerie too, as well, especially when you're just driving on a normal Louisiana type highway at that moment. And finally, my number one location, I got to go to Junction, Texas, where you're going to go to a place called Texas Tech University in Junction. So yes, it's one of those small campuses around that is actually part of the Texas Tech University system in Junction, Texas. They really don't have it as a year-wide campus. They only use it for like a couple of weeks for maybe summer school as well. But the reason why it's special has nothing to do with Texas Tech, but rather it was the site of the practice field of Paul Bear Bryant in his first season as head coach of the 1954 Texas A&M Aggies football team. So Paul Bear Bryant, who we now know as famous for being the head coach of Alabama, the greatest Alabama head coach until Nick Saban came along. He was the head coach. He had been hired as head coach of Texas A&M in 1954, and his job was to revive the team to turn that program into winners. And what he did was something that today would totally be unacceptable. But he took that team, he took them to Junction, Texas. And at that time, Junction was going through like a heat wave. It was very hot, and there was no water during the practice facilities. They had to practice on places where you had goat heads, cactuses, and potentially for animals. And they were out there for 10 days, and actually one player suffered a heat stroke and almost died on that field, on the practice fields. And there's a movie about it starring Tom Berenger called The Junction Boys. It was also based on a book by Jason Dent. And this was really interesting to see the site of the location. There's a state marker actually written on that. And I actually took a picture of that state marker while I was there. Let me pull it up real fast so I can read it for all you people that are listening in. So yeah, it was really cool. It was so amazing. But anyway, here was what it said. Paul Bear Bryant, former coach at Maryland and Kentucky, became head football coach at Texas A&M in 1954. To evaluate his new players, Bryant sought a preseason camp far from the main campus. The Texas A&M Adjunct opened in Junction in 1951 on 411 acres purchased by citizens of Kimball County. It was here that a grueling 10-day training camp thinned the roster while laying a foundation for future champions. Nearly 100 players filled 2 buses for the 250-mile drive to Junction on September 1st. Although the site was normally well-watered near the South Llano River, the region was in the grip of a long-term drought in 1954. There was hardly any grass, and one player recalled, anytime you got knocked down, you had to avoid the prickly sand spurs. With high heat, rough ground, and long practices, players slipped out by night. By the end of the camp, only 35 men remained to board buses returning to College Station. That fall, the team won a single game, the only losing record in Bryant's 38-year career. 2 years later, the 1956 team went undefeated, won the Southwest Conference, boasted 7 all-conference players, and finished ranked 5th in the nation. Many of the camp survivors were successful in their chosen careers, including 2 with long coaching careers in college and the National Football League. Bryant left Texas A&M for Alabama, winning 6 national championships and retiring as college football's winningest coach in 1982. Bryant and the Junction Boys met here again in 1979, reunited at a place which became legendary in Texas in American sports history. And interestingly enough, Paul Bear Bryant, when he died, he was wearing one ring. It was not any of his Alabama national championship rings. It was a ring that the Junction Boys had given him in honor of the 25th anniversary of their time in Junction, Texas. So that I thought was really cool. But it's currently Texas Tech University of Junction. I'm kind of curious as to why they actually swapped it out. But back then, it was the site of Texas A&M's historic 1954 team, just not in the way that you would think of it. But anyways, that was my top 5 list. Once again, I had the Pythian House in Weatherford, Texas, number 5. Number 4, Mount Olivet Cemetery. Number 3, Nickelodeon Studios. Number 2, Gibson, Louisiana. And number 1, Junction, Texas. So those are my top 5 underrated locations around the country that you should probably go visit if you have an opportunity to do so. And folks, that's going to do it for this podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. I'm glad to be back. Looking forward to posting another episode. Remember, you can listen to this podcast on Spotify and Podbean, and also I'm going to be uploading it to my YouTube channel at KWCLINE91. So once again, folks, I hope you guys have yourselves a really great day, and I'll see you next time on another episode of Crocking, Locking, and Dropping with